To understand why this crisis is so difficult to resolve, you have to understand the three overlapping fault lines that produced it. The first is the US-Iran nuclear impasse. Negotiations in Geneva collapsed in late 2025 after Iran accelerated uranium enrichment beyond the 60% threshold, and US intelligence assessed with high confidence that Iran was within weeks of weapons-grade capability. The strikes of February 28th were designed to set that program back by years. What they appear to have done instead is eliminate the political conditions under which Iran would ever return to a diplomatic framework. The second fault line is the fracturing of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, these are all states that depend on the Strait of Hormuz for their energy exports and, critically, their food imports. More than 80% of Gulf states' caloric intake arrives by sea through the strait. Iranian strikes on desalination plants, the source of 99% of drinking water in Kuwait and Qatar, have shifted this crisis from an economic disruption toward what analysts are now calling a humanitarian emergency in the Gulf itself. These are wealthy countries facing food and water shortages. That is a measure of how severe the situation is. The third fault line is China and the great power dimension. China and India have been the primary beneficiaries of selective Iranian permission to transit, receiving stranded Russian oil cargoes at discounted prices under emergency US waivers granted to India in early March. Beijing has made no move to help the US reopen the strait. On March 15th, President Trump demanded that NATO and China help the US restore free navigation. Neither responded with action. For China, a prolonged American entanglement in the Middle East, draining resources, raising oil prices for US allies in Asia, and straining NATO cohesion, is not obviously against its interests. The ceasefire announced this week is therefore fragile, in ways that go beyond the technical question of ship traffic. It pauses military operations. It does not resolve the nuclear question, the economic blockade, the humanitarian crisis in the Gulf, or the great power dimension. And critically, As the UAE's ADNOC CEO made clear, it has not actually opened the strait. So where does this go from here? There are three credible scenarios that analysts are mapping right now. The first is a negotiated reopening within weeks. This is the scenario the energy markets have partially priced in. Brent crude fell from $109 to around $95 on the ceasefire announcement. In this scenario, the Islamabad talks currently underway between US and Iranian intermediaries produce a framework under which Iran allows full commercial transit in exchange for sanctions relief and security guarantees. Oil prices would fall sharply. The global economy would absorb a significant but manageable shock. The probability here is real, but the window is narrowing. Every week the strait stays effectively closed. The humanitarian and economic damage deepens, and the political cost of a deal for both sides rises. The second scenario is a prolonged partial blockade, the current reality, extended for months. Iran continues to selectively allow transit for countries it deems non-hostile, while restricting passage for US and allied vessels. Oil prices stabilize in the $95–125 range. Europe faces a severe winter energy crisis. Asian economies absorb the shock with varying degrees of pain. Global inflation remains structurally elevated, and the Federal Reserve and European Central Bank face an impossible trade-off between fighting inflation and avoiding recession. Bloomberg economists are already projecting roughly 1 percentage point added to annual inflation in the euro area, with 0.6% knocked off GDP, and that assumes the current disruption, not an escalation. The third scenario is the one that energy traders and defense analysts are quietly running models on. An escalation that takes oil toward $200 per barrel. This happens if military action resumes, if Iranian mines are laid across Gulf Sea lanes as Tehran has threatened, or if Saudi oil infrastructure is struck. At that price, we are in territory that forces demand destruction globally, meaning recession, not just slowdown, across the developed world. The honest assessment from the people closest to this situation is that Scenario 1 is possible, Scenario 2 is the current baseline, and Scenario 3 is more likely than most people want to admit. Here is what I want you to take away from this. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is not a Middle East story. It is a global story. It is a story about food prices in the Philippines, heating costs in Germany, ferry schedules in South Korea, and inflation decisions at the Federal Reserve. It touches every economy on Earth, because the global energy system was built around the assumption that this waterway would always be open. That assumption no longer holds. The question now is not whether there will be lasting consequences. There will be. The question is whether the political will exists to create a new architecture for global energy security before the next crisis in this region, or the next choke point somewhere else, triggers a disruption that the world is even less prepared for. That is a conversation that governments, institutions, and citizens are going to be having for the rest of this decade. And this channel is going to be part of it. Next week, we're going deeper on the countries that are quietly winning in this crisis, the energy exporters and trade route alternatives that are reshaping the map of global commerce in real time. Make sure you're subscribed. I'll see you then.